what's the real world consequences for society, for the environment, for foreign policy of the endless creation of money?
Yes. I mean, this is a deep question. There are
Thank
many.
you.
There are many. The
That's what we got him in for.
because it takes us into multiple problems, which people often don't connect with banking and money. If I was to say to you that the plastic in the sea or global warming is connected to this system of money creation and banking and interest charges, then you'd be tempted to laugh if you were new to the subject. But I sincerely believe that the major cause of the environmental problems that we're having in the world, and the wealth inequality, and the conflict, the foreign policy issues, the immigrants on boats coming into Europe, half of this or more.
It's difficult to put a percentage
It's
on
difficult
it,
to
really.
put a percent, but I would say
a majority.
the biggest portion of that problem is because of the monetary system that we have.
And why is that? What's that got to do with the printing of money endlessly?
So one example is that let's go back to the golden receipts thing and start there. If let's say there were £100 of gold coins in circulation in the whole nation, and I, as a banker, create 500 receipts, £500 of receipts, and lend them to you at 30% interest, something like that. After 1 year, these £500 of receipts have to be repaid, and you have to pay me the interest charge. £30% on 500 is 150.
Yeah.
So you'd have to pay me 650.
Yeah.
Now the problem is that at the beginning of the year there was 100 of gold coins and 500 of paper notes, which the bank created. So there's only 600 of money in total in the whole society, in the whole nation.
Yeah.
And yet now the bank is asking the nation to repay 650. So the point is that at the end of every accounting period, there is not enough money to repay the debts that are owed to the bank.
Yeah.
Whether it's the government or the people or companies, in toto, there is not enough money to repay what we owe to the banks at the end of every year.
Yeah.
And the only way that society can react to that is by borrowing more money from the bank.
So it creates more to pay last year's interest requirement.
It creates more this year to repay the unrepayable debts which it loaned out last year. Now, this creates a very powerful and wealthy interest, I'm using that in the political sense, in the society, which is the banking system. And the banking system, naturally, because it has this power to bankrupt people by not lending them the money that they need to repay last year's debts, it gives it a power of patronage to finance which business it wants to survive, and those it doesn't, it can call the loans back, to support which government policies it wants. Because if it doesn't like a government's particular policy, it'll say, we won't buy your bonds. Right? And this power of patronage makes bankers the effective rulers. Number one. Number two, because society can't repay its debt, the natural reaction of businesses and people is to work harder, to earn more money.
Because you think, I have to get more productive in order to
I need to produce more to repay my debt because I'm not earning enough, which creates this forced economic growth where people are only working to repay debt, not to produce things that they need, but to produce for the sake of getting the money to repay the unrepayable debt, which itself never works anyway, because the problem they're facing is not one of not being able to produce enough. It's a problem that there isn't enough money, no matter how much they produce. By design. They could produce another planet Earth, and there would not be enough money.
Because you'd have to have a planet Earth plus Mars next year to repay back.
The system has 600 of money and is asking for 650 to repay, and it's only the bankers who can make the decision to create the other 50. You create another planet Earth, they don't need to create another 50 even.
Right? So in a way, interest is the incentive the banks have to create more money, and the creation of money continuously ad infinitum to prevent catastrophic inflation requires a continual production of goods and services, which ultimately result in the consumption of our entire environment, our entire lives, our mental well-being, in a bid to continuously produce, to kind of soak up all the new money that's continually being created. Right. And when that new money is not soaked up in produce and production, that can, I presume, spill over into wars, into resource finding, into new seeking new markets which have not been tapped, or if it doesn't, inflation,
which is just a tax on everybody.
Which is just a tax on everybody anyway. Yeah. So that's partly, is that partly the story of the global kind of inequalities, that the continuing kind of use of developing nations or underdeveloped nations to as new markets for our goods. That's part of things that I've read about recently.
Yeah.
That actually, our story of development is not a story of development with structural adjustment programs of the WHO and the IMF. Actually, we've been trying to the World Bank. Yeah, not WHO. Sorry, pandemics on my mind. Yeah. The IMF and the World Bank, the structural adjustment programs they put in place have actually resulted in so-called developing nations actually not developing at all, actually going backwards, and actually having their markets being opened up for products from the West, effectively, flooding those societies and preventing them from developing. And I guess the answer to all of that is that new money needs new markets, because otherwise it will result in catastrophic inflation back home.
Yeah, I think so. The plastic in the sea and the global warming from this forced economic growth that we're producing, and our industries are active and emitting carbon dioxide and refuse of all kinds. This is largely driven by this financial system that we have and the imperative to repay debt. So that's one of the issue of money creation and being able to indebt others who are then subservient to you because they have to repay you, and if they can't, then what do they do, right? Yeah. That issue is very pertinent in the developing world, because governments who are in debt to the World Bank or the IMF often overtly and sometimes covertly are told that you must repay, and if you don't, then we're going to dictate what your policies are. So the World Bank is very clear about this in its structural adjustment programs and that kind of thing, from the World Bank and the IMF, who basically tell finance ministers in countries what they can and can't do if they want more money, and because they're desperate for more money, they do what they're told.
And that happens to their own European nations, in fact. You look around to Greece and Yanis Varoufakis and his narration of how effectively he got told this is going to be your policy.
Yes, the power of the lender. So you were asking, about the consequences of the system, and you also mentioned wealth inequality, and there is another process there. And the fact is that when you go to a bank and you ask for a loan, it does really depend very much on how wealthy you already are as to whether you get that loan or not. Right? So you can get a loan from a bank very easily if you can show you don't really need the money. Yeah. And that's the old quip, but it is true. Bankers will look to see, does this man have old master paintings? Does he have shares in his pension? Does he have gold in the vault? Does he have a big house? Does he have property assets? If so, we'll lend you,
plenty of money,
2 million, whatever. Go and do your business.
Why is that? What's about the rich people that they can?
Well, because the bank will take security on the assets, and it knows that if you don't repay the money, it can take your house and sell it and get its loan back, or it can take your old master paintings and sell them and get its money back.
Which is amazing, because they kind of win either way. If you don't pay back the loan, they take your collateral for the money that they invented, and if you do pay back the loan with the interest,
they get the money anyway.
They get the profit.
Well, that's fine, but there's a bigger issue, and the issue is that when a poor guy goes to the bank to borrow money, the bank looks, have you got any collateral? Do you own any wealth? And the poor guy says no. And the bank says, well, I'm sorry, can't lend you. Now, the reason this is important is because if the banking system lends new capital to people who are already rich and doesn't lend new capital to people who are poor, then the people who get the new capital are the rich, and they become even richer. And the people who are poor stay poor. And wealth inequality therefore grows naturally, simply because we have a debt-based system. Now, if I can contrast that very quickly with an Islamic argument here about what happens in Islamic finance, the way that money is invested is not as a debt, it's not loaned at interest, it's invested on a profit-sharing basis.
Yeah.
So if I invest in you, if you're running a restaurant or a factory of some kind, and I say, I will invest 2 million in you and I'll share half your profits, then what really counts to me now is not whether you're a wealthy guy, but whether you're a clever guy, whether you've got a good business idea, whether the market is there for your product, whether you're honest, All those things count, but not how wealthy you are. And therefore, my decision is not based on your wealth. Therefore, if you're poor, but you've got a good idea, I will invest in you. And that will directly address the issue of wealth inequality, because the poor people will now get capital to play with and they'll have a chance to do business.
So it ties the capitalist with the entrepreneur and aligns their values and their aims and objectives.
It ties the bank with the entrepreneur.
The financier, yeah.
The financier. That's what I mean by capitalist.
Financier
the
with
financier
the
with the entrepreneur.
And it aligns their interests. And so the point that I have tried to make many times is that this system of equity, and we have equity investment where you buy shares in a company and share its profit and losses, that system is much better for financing society generally, and much better for addressing wealth inequality than this sort of
parasitic relationship.
Knee-jerk reaction. Every time we have a financial crisis, you'll hear the Chancellor stand up and say, we have to get the banks lending again. This is precisely why we have a financial crisis. Right?
Stop it, man!
And but it's like a knee-jerk reaction that you can't stop, and one chance after the other will say it, and you can look back 50 years and see this.
Tarek, I don't think they really understand.
Well, they may do.
I don't think they do understand.
Let's see what happens. Let's judge each one on his or her merits. But I think so far the history generally has been that they have not been willing to promote an alternative. We have plenty of new banks being proposed. We have very few new equity venture capital type investors being proposed at government level. Where are the big venture capitalists for the northern powerhouse in this country? Where are the big investment funds on an equity basis? They just aren't there, really. Not at the government policy level. They're not really promoting them.
This is really interesting because a lot of people have an issue with how, no matter how the real economy is doing, the financial economy and the financiers of the world seem to pretty much always be doing well. On the rare occasion, there's massive systemic banking failure. The government kind of just bails them out anyway. So you have the financial economy doing going really well like this, even if the real economy is tanking or doing unwell or not doing well. And what you were talking about with the equity thing and the fact that you can tie a financier's profits to the performance of a company in the real economy is that you're basically saying that the financial economy becomes unified with the real economy and only rises when the real economy rises and only falls when the real economy falls, which means that you don't create a banking elite that therefore have a huge amount of economic power and therefore political power. You don't create this kind of class of financial overlords that can dictate everything for the rest of society. They are there, like you said, like they're just servants of the rest of the people.
Well, that's one consequence, yes. Yeah. And banks, if they are lending to wealthy people or wealthy companies, they tend to encourage very, very much bigger companies to come into existence. If you're big and you get more loans, you become very big. If you're very big and you get more loans, you become very, very big. Yeah. And so we get a society of a very small number of very large corporations who are dominating business. Yeah. And everybody else becomes a low-waged employee for them. So there are consequences to connecting the financial economy with the real economy in the sense of the equity within the distribution of wealth in the society and the kind of society we have. And I can give you an example of something very mundane that people might not think of, but Saturday morning, there's a huge queue coming off the main road to go to the supermarket. And there are roadworks to make that junction bigger, to take that amount of traffic. This is because we have a monopoly of 5 or 6 grocers in this country now. And where we used to have 50,000 grocers, we've now got around 10,000 in the UK. And of those 10,000, there are a couple of thousand that are enormous sheds at major junctions where we all have to go to on a Saturday morning to shop. So we have congestion, and instead of having owner-managers running their own shop and knowing their groceries and knowing you personally, we have anonymous workers in a very large supermarket who are frankly dumbed down very often and don't know much about their business, because why should they? They don't they get paid the same whether they care or not. And that kind of thing Again, you might not identify that as a problem that comes from the monetary system, but this business giganticism, this monopolization of the efforts of society, this transformation of people from being owner-managers with some dignity and self-respect into low-paid, couldn't care less employees in a very large anonymous company. That kind of thing is a direct result of the money and banking system. So, connecting finance with the real economy it's not just about wealth inequality, it's about what sort of society we want to live in. Do we want to see a few huge house builders building 5,000 houses in your local field? Or do you want to have 500 small house builders building houses of variety in clumps of 5 or 6 dotted around several villages?
And the consequence, just to spell it out for people, that's all because of how money is created through debt. And debt attracts the people with the biggest collateral. So people with the biggest collateral get the most debt, they get leveraged up the most, they can build more houses, and then they have more assets, and then they can get more debt. And then they go and eat other smaller companies effectively,
that's right,
don't they?
For example, so you have the centralization where big company gets a loan from the bank and gobbles up small house builder, creates an even bigger house builder. It looks for one field to build 5,000 houses on.
Identical houses.
And it wants an architect to design 3 different types, so the variety is lost. So you can travel to so many British villages now and see that they're like clone towns. They've got the same 20 shops.
And this is something that people, I think, have an instinctive feeling about, which is that they go into the City of London and they look at the old architecture and they see, uniqueness, and they see variety, and they see subtlety between this street and this street and this street, and they're only 3 streets away. And then, you see the new builds and they're all identical. Yes. And so that's just one avenue. That's one aspect of life.
It's one small aspect. And I think if you read someone like Leon Krier, who writes on architecture, he says that the amount of architecture, the amount of building that was built pre-1945 in the world is roughly the same as the amount of building that has been done since 1945, believe it or not. At a rough guess, he says. And then he goes on, he says, if we were to lose all of the architecture that was built before 1945, people would say this is a real loss.
Yeah.
But if we were to lose everything post 1945, and one must ask the question, why?
Yeah.
Right. Why has our architecture become so poor? And again, the financial system is, if you look at the cost, if you have interest rates at 10%, for example, and you want to build a house, then around 60% of the cost of buying that house as an individual goes in interest charges to the bank on your mortgage. That 60% is the 60% that could have made the house beautiful, bigger garden, less density of developer, less like sardines packed in and more space around your property. That 60% is the beauty that we've given away to the banks and got nothing for.
Yeah.
Right. And we must at least ask that question, why has our architecture become so poor? It is largely driven by financial considerations, partly because we have these few very large house builders who are trying to reduce quality and uniform architecture.
And actually, it's not just architecture. I was thinking about movies.
Everything.
Clothes. Entertainment, clothes, arts. Almost anything that you buy and sell, this has happened to you because the producer has become conglomerated. And so this is a major point we need to emphasize, I think, which is that people do rail against the corporate culture and the dominance of corporations, even in the news media. There's like a handful of news media who then now dominate all of the news spheres and all the news channels. And so that has a consequence for receiving information. And propagandizing, how you're propagandized by institutions. So it actually influences every aspect of human life, doesn't it?
So in every aspect, you have interest-based finance, creating more monopolization, creating, like you're talking about with the local communities and the grocers, a loss of that sense of community, more turning us into drones, and a loss of artistry, and having all these insidious effects on essentially every sector because of the way that we do finance at the heart of it.
Yes, the centralization, the dumbing down, the loss of variety, the increasing control of a very small number of corporations in every area of business.